Have you ever pondered on the nature of God? Is God the benevolent, all-loving entity as we've been told? Picture the divine figure painted throughout history as an omnipotent, all-loving being, a figure of boundless compassion, infinite wisdom, and eternal love. This is the commonly accepted image of God, the celestial parent who watches over us. But what if the truth is far more complex, far more intriguing? Or could God in fact be the villain in our cosmic story? The idea may seem far-fetched, but there's a philosophical argument to support it. Let's dive into the philosophical realm where some scholars argue that the concept of God as an all-loving entity is incompatible with our world so full of suffering. Consider this: the problem of evil. It's a philosophical conundrum that has been debated for centuries. If God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, how can there be so much pain, cruelty, and injustice in the world? Shouldn't an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving deity prevent such atrocities? This paradox brings us to the Epicurean paradox, an ancient argument that questions the existence of a benevolent God. It's a fascinating discourse that has been stirring minds for generations, leading some to a rather controversial conclusion. So we have to ask ourselves, could a truly benevolent God allow such suffering? It's a question that challenges our conventional understanding of deity and divinity, and one that we'll continue to explore. The philosopher Epicurus once asked, "Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent." A profound question worth delving into, don't you think? Well, let's unpack this a little. Epicurus, a Greek philosopher, was known for his materialistic philosophy and his scrutiny of traditional notions of divinity. His question, often referred to as the Epicurean paradox, presents a compelling argument about the nature of God. It questions the omnipotence and benevolence of God, two attributes that are traditionally associated with him. Let's consider the first half of the question. Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? If this were the case, it would mean that God, despite his willingness to eliminate evil, lacks the power to do so. This would contradict the widely accepted belief of God being omnipotent or all-powerful. Now let's move on to the second part. Is God able but not willing? If God possesses the power to eradicate evil but chooses not to, it casts doubt on his benevolence. It brings into question whether God is as compassionate and kind as we are led to believe. This argument of Epicurus is not meant to dismiss the existence of God. Rather, it compels us to re-examine our understanding of God and his nature. It invites us to explore the possibility that God might not be the benevolent figure we've always perceived him to be. Now, this is not to say that God is malicious or evil, far from it. But it does suggest that if God allows evil to persist, despite having the power to prevent it, he might not be as benevolent as we traditionally believe. It implies that God, in his infinite wisdom, might have reasons beyond our comprehension to permit the existence of evil. This raises the question, if God is all-powerful and still allows evil, what does that make him? Now imagine for a moment that God is the villain. What would that look like? The implications of such a perspective are both disturbing and thought-provoking. If we were to entertain the idea of God as the villain, we'd have to reevaluate our understanding of the divine entity we've come to accept as benevolent and just. Consider the existence of suffering and evil in the world. If God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving as many religious doctrines profess, then why does he allow such pain and injustice to persist? This paradox, known as the problem of evil, has puzzled theologians and philosophers for centuries. But what if God isn't the benevolent figure we've been led to believe? What if instead he is akin to a villain, orchestrating suffering as part of some grand, inscrutable plan? This perspective could explain why an all-powerful, all-knowing deity would allow evil and suffering to exist. It would mean that God isn't failing to prevent these things, rather he is intentionally causing them. Just like a villain in a story, this interpretation of God would mean he has his own agenda, one that doesn't necessarily align with our notions of goodness and fairness. It's a chilling thought, but it does provide an answer to the problem of evil that is logically consistent with God's purported omnipotence and omniscience. This isn't to say that God is evil in the same way that a human might be, for such a comparison would be overly simplistic and anthropocentric. Rather, it suggests that God's morality might be beyond our comprehension, just as his existence is said to be beyond our understanding. Perhaps What we perceive as evil and suffering are simply part of a divine plan too complex for our finite minds to grasp. So if God were the villain, it would look a lot like the world we live in today, filled with suffering and injustice, but also with moments of beauty and joy, all part of a grand narrative we can't fully comprehend. A villainous God could certainly make sense of the world's suffering, couldn't it? Of course, there are those who argue that God is not the villain, but rather the misunderstood hero. This perspective offers a counter-argument that suggests God allows suffering for a greater purpose. They believe that suffering is not indicative of a villainous God, but rather a God that values the concept of free will. Now, let's delve into the idea of free will. It's the power of acting without the constraint of necessity or fate, the ability to act at one's own discretion. According to proponents of this view, God gave humans free will to make their own choices, to learn and grow from their experiences. This is where the presence of evil comes into play. If God were to intervene every time we were about to make a wrong choice, it would no longer be free will, would it? Consider this. A parent might let their child touch a hot stove despite knowing they'll get burnt. Why? Because the child needs to learn the consequences of their actions. The pain is temporary, but the lesson is eternal. Some argue this is how God operates, allowing suffering as a means of learning, growth, and character development. Furthermore, they suggest that suffering can serve a higher purpose. It might not always be apparent to us, but they believe that suffering can lead to greater empathy, resilience, and understanding. It can foster community as we come together to support each other in times of need. Yet this perspective is not without its flaws. It's easy to talk about free will when discussing human actions, but what about natural disasters? What about diseases that afflict the innocent? These aren't the result of any human's free will. So while the argument of free will provides some explanation for the existence of evil and suffering in the world, it falls short in explaining all forms of suffering. It's a compelling argument indeed, but it doesn't cover the full scope of the problem of evil in the world. Free will, however, doesn't explain all the suffering, does it? So where does that leave us in our quest to understand the nature of God? We've journeyed through a catacomb of thoughts, ideas, and beliefs, each one more challenging than the last. We began with the Provocative Query, a question designed to shake the foundations of our understanding. The question wasn't meant to vilify or sanctify, but to encourage deep reflection on our perceptions of the divine. Setting the stage, we explored the traditional concept of God, an omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent being, a deity who loves unconditionally yet allows suffering and evil to exist. We then moved on to the argument that unfolded, a proposition that was difficult for many to digest. The idea of God as a villain. We looked at the suffering in the world, the natural disasters, the diseases, the wars, the poverty, and the pain. We considered that, if God is all-powerful and all-knowing, then surely he is aware and capable of preventing these calamities. Yet, these events persist. This perspective provided a compelling argument for those who see God in a more villainous light. But then we shifted our gaze to the devil's advocate, the counter-argument that challenges this perspective. We explored the possibility that God allows suffering as a means for growth, for the evolution of our souls. We considered that perhaps we are co-creators of our reality, and the pain and suffering we experience are products of our collective choices. This perspective invites us to take responsibility for our actions and our world, rather than placing the blame solely on a divine entity. The counter-argument also proposed that our understanding of God is limited by our human perception, that perhaps the divine operates on a plane of existence that we cannot fully comprehend, where concepts of good and evil are not as black and white as we perceive them to be. In the end, we are left with more questions than answers. Are we victims of a villainous deity, co-creators of our reality, or simply beings trying to understand a divine entity that operates beyond our comprehension? Perhaps understanding God is not about finding definitive answers, but in continually asking the hard questions. So let's keep asking, let's keep exploring, and let's keep the conversation going, because in the quest for understanding, the journey is just as important as the destination.